and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. Back in 2013, I had just gotten a dog. For the first month, everything seemed normal. I was excited to have a new pet in the house, and most of my attention went toward feeding him, playing with him, and getting used to the responsibility. Then, without any clear reason, I began feeling as though someone was watching me. It was not connected to a particular room or time of day at first. I would simply become aware of the space behind me, or the dark corners of the house. I would turn around expecting to find a family member standing nearby, but no one was there. I tried to ignore it. People sometimes feel watched when they are anxious or tired. A new dog can also make a house feel different. Every small movement, scratch, or unexplained sound becomes more noticeable because you are constantly listening for the animal. I told myself that was all it was. Over the next several days, however, I began having strange nightmares. The most common dream involved a creature standing in the middle of a street. The best way I can describe it is as a ridiculous-looking mixture of a dragon and dinosaur. It was not realistic in the way an animal in a nature documentary might look. Its proportions were strange, and there was something almost foolish about its face. Despite that, it terrified me. The creature never needed to chase me. It simply stood in the street and stared. The surroundings in the dream were usually empty. There were no cars, pedestrians, or people calling from nearby houses. It felt as though the entire place had been cleared so that the creature could watch me without interruption. It did not roar or bare its teeth. It only looked at me. Every time the dream reached its worst point, I felt an immense pressure come down on my body. It was as if something heavy had been placed on my chest and limbs at the same time. I could not move properly. I could not breathe normally. Then I would wake. The room would still be dark. For several seconds after opening my eyes, the pressure seemed to remain. I would lie there trying to understand whether I was fully awake or still trapped in the dream. Eventually, the sensation faded. At the time, I did not know much about sleep paralysis. I only knew that I was having nightmares and waking with the feeling that something had been pressing me into the mattress. The dreams repeated enough that I began dreading bedtime. Even when I had not experienced anything unusual during the day, I expected the creature to be waiting for me once I fell asleep. Then came the night I saw the shadow figure. It was late, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed with a view of the hallway outside my room. The hallway was completely dark. For some reason, I stared into it. I do not know whether I had heard something first or whether I simply felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I remember focusing on the darkness for several seconds, waiting for my eyes to adjust. The longer I stared, the darker the hallway seemed to become. It was as though the blackness was thickening rather than clearing. Then a figure stepped into view from the left side. It looked like a shadow shaped roughly like a person. The body was dark enough that I could not see clothing, skin, or individual features. It seemed to absorb the little light that reached the hallway. Its eyes were bright red. They stood out clearly against the darkness. Where its ears should have been, two gray horns extended from the sides of its head. The horns were not enormous, but they were clearly visible. Their lighter color made them easier to see than the rest of the figure. It turned toward me. I knew it was looking directly at me. The sight lasted only a moment before panic took over. I threw myself beneath the blankets. As a child, I still believed blankets provided some kind of protection. If I could not see the figure, perhaps it could not see me. If I remained covered and completely still, maybe it would leave. I pulled the fabric over my head and held it tightly around me. Then I heard the thumping. Something moved around outside the blankets. Thump, a pause. Then another heavy impact. The sound was not quick like footsteps from someone running. It was slow and deliberate, as though something heavy was walking or striking the floor, one movement at a time. I did not look. I was too afraid that lifting the blanket would reveal the red-eyed figure standing beside the bed. The thumping continued for what felt like a long time. I could not tell whether it remained in the hallway or entered the room. Sound behaves strangely when your head is covered. Each impact seemed muffled but close, and I could not judge the direction accurately. I remained under the blankets, waiting. At some point, the thumping stopped. There was no final footstep moving away. No door closed. The sound simply ended. Then, suddenly, it was daytime. Sunlight filled the room. I had no memory of falling asleep. One moment, I had been hiding beneath the blankets at night, listening to the thumps. The next moment, I was awake in the middle of the day. The sudden jump in time disturbed me almost as much as the figure. I had expected to remain awake until morning. Instead, several hours had disappeared without any memory of relaxing, uncovering my face, or drifting back to sleep. I told my parents what had happened. I described the dark figure, its red eyes, and the gray horns. I showed them the part of the hallway where it had appeared. They told me I had probably experienced a bad dream. That was the most reasonable explanation. I had already been having nightmares, and the creature from the street may have changed into a more human shape. I might have awakened only partly, seen a shadow in the hallway, and carried the nightmare into my room. The pressure and inability to move could have been sleep paralysis. The thumping may have been part of the same hallucination. But I insisted that I had been awake. I remembered choosing to stare into the hallway. I remembered the figure entering from one side. I remembered diving under the blankets and hearing the impacts afterward. It did not feel like a normal dream. While I was still trying to convince my parents, we heard something near the front door. Thump. We all became quiet. Then, it happened again. Thump, thump. The same slow sound I remembered from the night before seemed to be coming from the other side of the door. I became terrified. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a pan because it was the closest thing I could find that might work as protection. Holding it in front of me, I called out, "Who's there?" There was no answer. The thumping stopped. My father walked toward the door. I stayed behind him, still holding the pan. He opened it. No one was there. The area outside appeared empty. There was no person walking away, no animal near the entrance, and no object that had fallen against the door. My father looked around and found nothing unusual. He told me to get some rest. My parents said they had not heard anything clearly enough to believe someone was outside. Maybe they thought the noise had come from elsewhere in the house. Perhaps a pipe had moved. A branch could have struck part of the building. An animal may have bumped against the door and run before my father opened it. To me, however, it sounded exactly like the thumping from the hallway. That connection made the experience feel real. The figure had not remained confined to a nightmare. The sound had followed me into the day. After that, I began sleeping with the light on. Darkness no longer felt empty. Whenever the room went completely black, I imagined the figure waiting in the hallway, preparing to step into view again. The light made it easier to see the doorway and furniture. It reduced the shadows that could become faces or bodies. It did not remove the fear completely, but it made sleep possible. For a long time, I did not experience any normal dreams or nightmares that I could remember. I would go to bed and then wake in the morning with nothing between those moments. That is not necessarily unusual. Most people dream every night, but forget nearly everything before waking. I may still have been dreaming without retaining the memories. At the time, however, it seemed as though the nightmares had stopped completely. The red-eyed figure did not return. The strange dragon-like creature was gone. The pressure no longer woke me. Years passed. Then, more recently, I had another dream. In it, a mysterious child was inside my room. I did not recognize the child. I could not clearly understand whether it was a boy or girl or how old it was. The strongest detail was what had happened to the room. Everything had been destroyed. Objects were thrown around or broken. The familiar space had become unrecognizable, as though the child had entered while I was away and deliberately ruined everything. I looked at the child and managed to ask one question. "Who are you?" The child did not answer. Instead, the same pressure returned. It came down on my body with the same overwhelming force I remembered from 2013. I could not move. I felt trapped beneath something invisible. Then, I woke. It was 6 in the morning. Daylight was already shining through the windows. The room was normal. Nothing had been destroyed. The mysterious child was gone. But the pressure had felt exactly the same. That was what frightened me most. Years had passed since the earlier experiences, yet the physical sensation returned unchanged. It felt as though the new dream had been connected to the old ones. The figure was different, but the pressure was the same. Since then, sleeping without a light has remained difficult. When I leave the room dark, it takes much longer for me to fall asleep. I become too aware of every sound. Sometimes I hear a thump. Then, about 15 seconds later, another. The pattern seems to move closer. Thump, silence, thump, silence. Each sound makes me imagine something approaching the room one slow step at a time. Then, just when it feels close, the noise seems to fade away. Eventually, I wake in the morning without remembering exactly when it stopped. No one else hears these sounds. My parents never believed the experiences were anything more than dreams, and my friends have not believed me either. I understand their doubt. The events happen late at night, usually when I am falling asleep or waking. That is exactly when sleep-related hallucinations occur. The pressure is one of the clearest signs. During sleep paralysis, the brain wakes while the body remains temporarily unable to move. A person may feel pressure on the chest, sense someone nearby, and see threatening figures in the room. Many people describe dark shapes, glowing eyes, demons, strangers, or creatures standing in doorways. They may also hear footsteps, knocking, voices, or heavy impacts. The hallucination often ends suddenly, and the person may fall asleep again without remembering the transition. That explanation fits nearly everything I experienced. The dragon-like creature could have been an ordinary nightmare. The pressure could have been sleep paralysis. The horned figure may have been a hallucination layered over the real hallway. The thumping could have been an auditory hallucination or normal house noise interpreted through fear. The sudden change from night to daytime may mean I fell asleep immediately after the episode ended. The mysterious child, years later, could have triggered another episode of the same sleep condition. Even the feeling of being watched is common when someone is anxious or sleep-deprived. The mind becomes alert to possible threats and begins assigning meaning to shadows and small noises. A hallway is especially effective at creating fear because it provides a dark space that leads beyond the bedroom. You can see enough to expect something, but not enough to confirm that it is empty. The red eyes may have come from a small light, reflection, or object in the hallway. 2 points of light can become eyes when the brain is frightened. The gray horns could have been part of furniture, a doorway decoration, or shadows along the wall. Once my mind formed a face, the entire shape may have seemed to step forward. The thumping at the front door the following day may have been coincidence. An animal could have struck it. Someone might have knocked and left. The house could have shifted or produced a mechanical sound. Because I had heard thumping during the night, I immediately connected the two events. My parents' failure to hear it clearly suggests the sound may not have been as loud as it seemed to me. Fear can make ordinary noises feel much closer and more threatening. These are all reasonable explanations. They are probably correct. But the experiences still feel connected in a way that is difficult to dismiss emotionally. The same pressure appeared years apart. The same kind of sudden mourning followed both events. The thumping returns whenever I try to sleep in darkness. I sometimes wonder whether the light changes my expectations rather than the room itself. When the light is on, I can identify normal sounds. A pipe is a pipe. A pet moving is a pet. The building settling is only the building settling. When the light is off, each sound becomes a possible footstep. My fear fills in what I cannot see. That could explain why the thumps seem to approach and then fade. I focus on them until I become tired enough to fall asleep. As consciousness fades, the sounds become less distinct. In the morning, it feels as though they stopped on their own. My new dog may also have influenced the beginning of the experience. Animals make noises at night. They move through hallways, bump into doors, scratch at the floor, and shift while sleeping. A young dog unfamiliar with the house might wander around after everyone went to bed. The thumping I heard could have been the dog walking or playing. The feeling of being watched may have come from knowing another living thing was moving through the home. I do not remember whether the dog reacted to the hallway figure. If the dog had barked, growled, or stared at the same location, that would have given the sighting another witness. As far as I know, the experience belonged only to me. That makes a sleep explanation more likely. Still, while I was beneath the blankets, the thumping did not sound like a dog. It sounded heavier. It felt deliberate. I imagined the horned figure walking around the room, waiting for me to look. Perhaps I remained under the blankets long after the hallucination ended, interpreting every small house noise as proof that it was still nearby. That is how fear can sustain itself. The initial image lasts only seconds. The mind keeps the danger alive for hours. The statement I used to make, that it would hunt me until the day I died, came from that fear. At night, the experiences felt permanent. I believed something had noticed me in 2013 and would continue returning in different forms. The dragon, the red-eyed figure, the mysterious child. Maybe they were disguises used by the same presence. That was how I connected them when I was frightened. Now I know there may be a simpler connection. All three came from the same mind during sleep. They shared the pressure because my body was entering the same state. They appeared in different forms because the brain uses different images each time. The threatening presence may not be an external creature following me. It may be the sensation of sleep paralysis itself, given a face by fear. Knowing that helps, but it does not make the experiences harmless. Sleep paralysis can be terrifying even when you understand it. A person can know that the figure is not real and still feel certain it is standing beside the bed. The body's alarm system reacts before logic can take control. The pressure feels physical. The eyes appear visible. The footsteps sound as though they are moving through the actual room. I still sleep more comfortably with a light on. Part of me feels embarrassed about that, but the habit developed for a reason. The light reminds me where the walls are. It keeps the hallway from becoming a solid black space. It allows me to see that no horned figure has stepped into the doorway. Sometimes I consider leaving the room dark and forcing myself to become accustomed to it. Then the first thump comes. I wait. About 15 seconds later, I hear another. It seems closer, even when I know it could be plumbing, a pet, a neighbor, or the building settling. I begin listening for the next one. The darkness makes the distance impossible to judge. By the time the sound fades, I am exhausted. Then morning arrives. The room is normal. Nothing has entered. The door remains closed or unchanged. There are no footprints, broken objects, or marks proving that something walked toward me. That absence matters. Every frightening event ends without physical evidence. The hallway figure did not leave damage. The person at the door vanished without a trace. The child destroyed my room only inside the dream. The pressure disappeared as soon as I fully woke. Everything points towards sleep and fear rather than a creature. But memories do not always obey evidence. I can still picture the figure entering from the left side of the hallway. The body was black. The eyes were bright red. Gray horns rose where its ears should have been. It looked at me as though it had found exactly who it came for. I pulled the blankets over my head. Then, something began moving through the darkness. Thump, a long pause. Thump, I waited for it to reach the bed. Instead, the sound stopped, and several hours vanished. When I opened my eyes, daylight filled the room. Years later, the mysterious child appeared, and the same crushing pressure returned. Maybe all of it was caused by sleep paralysis. That is the explanation I want to believe. It means nothing has followed me. Nothing waits in the hallway. Nothing is hunting me. But whenever I turn off the light and the first distant thump breaks the silence, my body reacts before I can remind myself of any explanation. I lie awake and listen. 15 seconds pass. Then it happens again. A little closer. When I was 5 or 6 years old, my family lived in an apartment that never felt completely ordinary to me. I was too young to understand the history of the building or know whether anything unusual had happened there before we moved in. To me, it was simply home. I knew the rooms, the hallway, the sounds from neighboring apartments, and the way light from outside moved across the walls at night. Most of the time, nothing frightening happened. But there were certain moments in that apartment that have stayed with me for years. The clearest one happened after I woke from a nightmare. The dream had been about a tornado. I do not remember every detail, but I remember the feeling of it. The sky had become dark, the wind was violent, and everything around me seemed in danger of being pulled away. At 5 or 6 years old, a tornado was one of the most terrifying things I could imagine. I woke suddenly in my bed. My heart was still racing from the dream, and for the first few seconds, I did not fully understand where I was. The room was dark, but familiar shapes slowly became visible. The walls were still, there was no wind, the apartment was quiet. I realized I was safe in my bedroom. Then, I saw the girl. She was standing near my bed, or at least close enough that I could see her clearly. She looked like a little girl, not much older than I was. She wore a white dress. I do not remember any colorful pattern or decoration on it. The dress was pale enough to stand out in the darkness, which may be why I noticed her so quickly. She did not move toward me. She did not speak. She only stood there and stared. I could not understand why another child was in my room. There was no reason for anyone to be there in the middle of the night. I did not hear a door open, and I had not heard footsteps before waking. For a few seconds, I stared back. I was too frightened to call for my mother. The girl's face was visible, but I cannot remember enough details to describe it properly. I do not remember her smiling, frowning, or showing any strong emotion. The most important thing was the way she watched me. She seemed completely aware that I was awake. Then she disappeared. There was no movement. She did not turn and walk through the doorway. She did not duck behind furniture or fade slowly. One moment she was standing there, and the next she was simply gone. The whole sighting lasted only a few seconds. That should have made it easier to dismiss. I had just awakened from a nightmare. My mind may still have been partly asleep, and the little girl could have been an image left over from the dream. But at 5 or 6, I did not know anything about sleep-related hallucinations. I only knew that I had opened my eyes and seen someone standing in my room. I was seriously frightened. I probably called for my mother or hid beneath the blankets. I do not remember exactly what I did immediately afterward. What I remember is the girl, the white dress, the staring, the sudden disappearance. That was not the only unusual thing I experienced in the apartment. I also frequently saw shadows of tall people moving across my wall. Sometimes they looked as though they were dancing. The figures appeared stretched and much taller than normal human beings. Their arms or bodies moved across the wall, even when there was no obvious person in the room creating them. At first, I assumed they came from outside. Headlights passing through a window can throw moving shadows across a room. People walking beneath streetlights can appear huge when their silhouettes are projected onto a wall. Tree branches can also create shapes that resemble arms, legs, or people swaying. An apartment building is full of moving lights. Cars arrive and leave. Neighbors turn lamps on and off. Television screens flicker. Curtains move. Any of those things could create shadows that look alive to a frightened child. But these shadows did not always look random. They seemed human. They moved with a rhythm that reminded me of dancing. Sometimes more than one tall figure appeared. I would watch them slide across the wall, their bodies bending and stretching as the light changed. The experience frightened me. But after seeing the shadows repeatedly, part of me became used to them. I still did not like them. I simply learned that they usually disappeared without coming closer. What made the experiences more difficult to explain was that I was not the only person in my family who claimed to see them. My sister saw the shadows too. She described tall figures moving on the walls, similar to what I had seen. I do not remember whether we witnessed them at exactly the same time or discussed them afterward, but I knew the experience was not entirely mine. That mattered to me. Adults could say a young child imagined a little girl after a nightmare. They could say I mistook headlights for people, but when my sister also saw the shadows, I felt less alone. Someone else understood what I meant. My mother believed me too. She claimed she had seen a little girl in a white dress in the apartment. I do not know whether her sighting happened before or after mine. I also do not know whether she described every detail exactly the same way. What mattered was that she recognized the figure. When I told her what I saw, she did not laugh or immediately tell me it was only a dream. She had seen a similar child. That realization frightened me in a new way. If I had been the only witness, I could eventually accept that my brain created the image while waking from the tornado nightmare. But my mother was an adult. She had not been inside my dream. If she saw a little girl in a white dress too, then perhaps someone really did appear in that apartment. Of course, shared stories can influence memory. If my mother heard me describe the girl first, she may have connected my story to something vague she had seen before. A pale reflection or small shadow could become a girl in white after hearing my account. The same thing could happen with my sister. One person describes tall dancing shadows, and another begins interpreting ordinary shapes in the same way. Families influence each other without meaning to. We remember events together, and over time, different memories can begin to match. That is possible. But as a child, I did not think in those terms. I thought a dead girl might be living in the apartment with us. I wondered where she went when she disappeared. Maybe she remained in the room but became invisible. Perhaps she stood in the hallway at night, watching us sleep. I wondered whether the shadows were connected to her. Maybe the tall figures were other people in the same place she came from. The idea that multiple unseen people moved through the apartment made every dark room feel uncertain. Still, nothing openly violent happened. The little girl did not touch me. The shadows did not leave the walls. No one was injured. The experiences were frightening because they were unexplained, not because anything attacked us. Eventually, we moved away. As I became older, the memories became less immediate. I stopped seeing the girl. The dancing shadows did not follow me to every new place. That supports the idea that the apartment itself caused the experiences, either through its lighting and layout or through something less ordinary. Even now, walking past that building gives me chills. In daylight, it looks like an ordinary apartment. Other people probably live there now, going through normal routines without ever seeing anything unusual. But when I look toward it, I remember being small and waking from a nightmare. I remember the girl in white standing close to my bed. I know that years have passed and that memory is unreliable. I may not remember the room exactly as it was. The girl may have been a coat hanging on furniture, a pale curtain, or moonlight creating the shape of a body. When I opened my eyes, my half-dreaming brain may have given the shape a face. This kind of experience can happen during the transition between sleep and waking. A person may see someone standing in the room for a few seconds before the image disappears. The figure can appear solid and detailed. Children are especially likely to interpret the image literally because they do not understand what their brains are doing. The timing after a nightmare strongly supports that explanation. I woke frightened and confused. My mind may have remained partly inside the dream. The tornado disappeared, but the feeling of danger remained. My brain placed a silent little girl in the room to carry that fear. Then, as I became fully awake, she vanished. That is reasonable. The shadows also have normal explanations. Passing headlights can create human-shaped movement. A car turning a corner can make a shadow slide from one wall to another, rise, bend, and disappear. If tree branches move between the light and window, the resulting figure may appear to wave or dance. Several moving branches can look like multiple tall people. If my sister and I slept in rooms facing the same street, we might both see the same patterns. My mother may have seen a similar shadow and understood why we were frightened. There is no need for ghosts. But reasonable explanations do not erase the emotional truth of the memories. At 5 or 6, I saw a child standing in my room. My sister saw tall shapes moving across the walls. My mother believed us because she claimed to see the little girl, too. Those experiences became part of the apartment in my mind. There was also another reason my mother may have been willing to believe us. She had grown up in a house where far more disturbing things supposedly happened. This was before I was born. According to my mother, the house was extremely active. The person who built it regularly heard a baby crying in the basement. The crying did not seem to come from a child living in the house. It came from below, where no baby should have been. My mother sometimes heard it too. A baby crying is a powerful sound. People are naturally drawn to it and feel an immediate need to respond. Hearing that sound from a basement would be especially disturbing because the listener would need to decide whether to go down and search. If the crying stopped whenever someone approached, it would create the feeling that something was deliberately calling from the darkness. There are ordinary noises that resemble babies. Cats can produce cries that sound almost exactly like infants. Pipes can squeal or moan. Wind passing through gaps can create high-pitched sounds. Basements also distort echoes from other parts of a house. A real baby in a nearby home might sound as though it were beneath the floor, but my mother believed the crying belonged to the house. It happened often enough that even the original builder apparently heard it. My mother's brother also had repeated experiences there. I will call him Tim. Tim said that a man stood in his bedroom at night and watched him. The figure appeared tall and dark. It remained in a corner of the room, staring toward the bed. My mother did not believe him at first. Children and teenagers often frighten one another with stories, and she may have assumed he was exaggerating or inventing the man for attention. Eventually, she challenged him. She told Tim that she would sleep in his room and see the man for herself. She probably expected the night to pass normally. If nothing appeared, she could prove that he had been imagining it. So, she slept in his room. The house became quiet, and both of them went to bed. At around 3 in the morning, my mother woke. Tim was awake beside her. He whispered, "He's here." My mother looked toward the corner. A tall man was standing there. Most of his body looked like a shadow. She could not see normal clothing, skin, or facial features. The darkness seemed to form his shape. But his eyes were different. She said they looked real. The body may have appeared like a flat silhouette, but the eyes had depth and presence. They were focused on Tim and my mother. The figure did not need to approach. Standing silently in the corner was enough. My mother had entered the room expecting to prove that her brother was lying. Instead, she saw what he had been describing. I do not know how long the man remained there. I do not know whether my mother and Tim ran, turned on a light, or hid under the blankets. That part of the story was never as clear to me as the image itself. A tall shadow with real eyes stood in the corner, watching them both. That event changed the way my mother viewed Tim's claims. He had not only imagined the figure. At least, she no longer believed he had. She witnessed something beside him. My mother said that was only one of many strange things that happened in the house. The crying baby and the man in Tim's room represented only part of the activity. I never heard every story in complete detail, or perhaps I have forgotten some of them. The house remained known in our family as a place where unusual things happened. That background may explain why my mother believed me when I described the little girl. She already believed that people could see figures others could not. She had once doubted her own brother, then shared the same experience. When her children began describing a girl in white and dancing shadows, she did not want to make the same mistake. There may be a psychological explanation connecting the generations. My mother grew up hearing ghost stories about her house. Those stories shaped how she interpreted noises and shadows later in life. When we lived in the apartment, she may have unintentionally passed that awareness to us. Children pay close attention to their parents' fears. Even if she never told us everything directly, we may have sensed that she believed some houses held unseen people. A pale shape became a ghost because that possibility already existed in our family. The same expectation may have influenced my sister. That does not mean anyone lied. We may all have honestly experienced ordinary sights and sounds through the same supernatural framework. The baby crying could have been an animal. The tall man could have been a coat, furniture, or a sleep hallucination. My mother and Tim may have awakened in the same frightened state and interpreted the same shadow as a person. The little girl in my apartment could have been another sleep-related image. The dancing people could have been headlights. Each story has a possible natural explanation, but taken together, they create a pattern that is harder to dismiss emotionally. My mother heard a baby in an empty basement. Her brother saw a man in a corner. She slept in his room and saw the man too. Years later, I saw a little girl in white in our apartment. My mother said she had seen her as well. My sister and I both saw tall shadows moving across the walls. The experiences repeated across different homes and different members of the family. Maybe our family is unusually sensitive to shadows, sounds, and sleep disturbances. Perhaps certain visual patterns affect us in similar ways. Genetics can influence sleep conditions, anxiety, and how the brain processes sensory information. If several family members experience sleep paralysis or vivid waking dreams, they may describe similar figures. Tall shadow people are extremely common in sleep-related hallucinations. So are figures standing beside beds, children in pale clothing, voices, and the feeling of being watched. The fact that the same themes appear in our family may support a shared biological explanation rather than a supernatural one. At the same time, my sister seeing the wall shadows while awake remains difficult for me to dismiss. If we saw them together, the light source must have been real. The shapes may have been ordinary, but the movement existed outside one person's mind. My mother's experience with Tim also involved two witnesses. Shared hallucinations are possible, but less common than two people misinterpreting the same physical object. Perhaps the tall man in the corner was a coat or shadow that looked human in low light. Tim's warning prepared my mother to see it that way. Once she looked, the suggestion shaped the image. The real eyes could have been reflections from metal, glass, or another object. Likewise, my mother may have described the girl in white after hearing my story, making our memories seem closer than they originally were. These explanations are possible because memory is flexible. I cannot return to those nights and test the rooms. I cannot recreate the exact lighting. I cannot know what details were discussed before each person saw something. I only know how the stories have been remembered. As I grew older, I became less certain that any of the figures were ghosts. I understand how powerful a child's imagination can be. I understand that waking from a nightmare can place dream images into the real room. I know shadows can appear to move, especially when you stare at them in darkness. I also know families can unintentionally reinforce each other's beliefs. But knowing all of that does not stop the chills when I pass the old apartment. The building is tied to one of my earliest memories of pure fear. I can still imagine the room after the tornado dream. The darkness, the moment of relief when I realized the storm was not real. Then the little girl standing there. She did not need to look monstrous. She was not covered in blood. She had no unnatural eyes or distorted face. She appeared like an ordinary child in a white dress. That simplicity made her more believable. For a few seconds, I accepted that another girl was physically present. Then, she vanished without explanation. Sometimes I wonder whether she was curious rather than threatening. She only looked at me. Maybe, if anything supernatural exists, she was another child connected to the apartment. Perhaps she had once lived there. Maybe she did not understand why my family occupied the room she remembered. That interpretation is gentler than imagining something pretending to be a little girl. There is no evidence for either idea. I never learned of a child dying in the building. We did not research the apartment's history. There was no name, date, or story connected to her. she remained only an image. The dancing shadows seemed less personal. They did not come close or focus on us. They moved across the wall like figures performing somewhere far away, visible only as silhouettes. Sometimes I think they may have been the shadows of people outside, stretched by light from passing cars. The movement could easily resemble dancing. That is probably what they were. But my sister saw them too. When someone shares an experience, even an explainable one, it becomes harder to forget. My mother's old house stories also stayed with me because of the way disbelief changed into belief. She thought Tim was lying. She entered his room expecting to prove it. At 3 in the morning, he whispered that the man had arrived. Then she looked into the corner and saw him. That sequence resembles what happened when I told my family about the girl. Someone else had already seen enough to believe me. Maybe our family learned not to dismiss each other because strange things seemed to happen around us. Or maybe we learned to interpret uncertainty in the same way. I do not know. I have not seen the little girl again. I no longer see tall figures dancing on my walls. The experiences did not continue into every home I lived in. That makes me believe the apartment's lighting and my young age played major roles. If an entity had attached itself to me, I would expect the sightings to follow. They did not. The memories remain behind with the building. My mother's childhood house was different, but I never lived there during the events she described. All I know comes from her stories. They may have become more dramatic through years of retelling. The baby's crying may not have happened as often as I imagine. The man in the corner may have been visible only for a second. But the fear in her voice when she spoke about it felt genuine. She remembered entering Tim's room as a septic and leaving as someone who had seen the same thing. That may be why she never laughed at me. When I said a girl in white had been standing in my bedroom, my mother understood what it was like to see someone who should not be there. My sister understood the shadows. They were the only people who believed me. Their belief comforted me, but it also made the apartment more frightening. If everyone had called it a dream, perhaps I would have forgotten. Instead, the sighting became part of a larger family pattern. Years later, I can still picture all of them. The little girl beside my bed, the tall silhouettes dancing on the wall, the baby crying somewhere beneath the floor of my mother's childhood home, the dark man standing in the corner of Tim's room with eyes that looked more solid than the rest of him. Every event may have a reasonable explanation. A nightmare, headlights, animals, old pipes, sleep paralysis, suggestion, memory changing over time. I accept all of those possibilities. But the stories remain unsettling because no single explanation covers everything. I woke from a tornado nightmare and saw a child watching me. My mother claimed she saw the same child. My sister saw the same kinds of moving shadows I did. Years earlier, my mother tested her brother's story and found a dark man standing exactly where he said he would be. Sometimes I think our family only notices things other people ignore. Sometimes I think we are simply more likely to give human shapes to darkness. Either way, I still do not like passing the apartment. I look at the windows and wonder who sleeps in my old room now. Maybe no one there has ever seen anything. Maybe the girl disappeared when we left. Or maybe another child has awakened from a nightmare, opened their eyes, and found her standing quietly beside the bed. A little girl in a white dress, watching, then gone. Three years ago, when I worked at Starbucks, I had worked enough closing shifts by then to know the routine almost automatically. By the final hours of the night, the store usually became quieter, and we would begin cleaning whatever we could without interfering with the last customers. There were counters to wipe, dishes to wash, machines to clean, ingredients to restock, rubbish to take out, and a long list of smaller jobs that had to be completed before we could lock the doors and leave. Even when the cafe itself was empty, the drive-through could remain active. A few cars might arrive close together, followed by 10 or 15 minutes of silence. That made closing unpredictable. We would start cleaning one area, hear the drive-through alert, stop what we were doing, make an order, and then return to the task afterward. That night, I was closing with a borrowed partner from another Starbucks a short distance down the road. He did not normally work at our location, but he had been sent over to help cover the shift. He was an awesome guy and easy to work with. I remember thinking that I wished he had been permanently assigned to our store. He knew what he was doing, communicated clearly, and did not make the shift more stressful than it needed to be. That became important later because neither of us could dismiss the strange event as one employee misunderstanding the other. We were both experienced enough to recognize what had and had not happened. Around that time, Starbucks had recently introduced a limited-time Horchata Frappuccino promotion. The drink was not especially popular at our location. Most customers continued ordering the usual flavors, so when someone requested Horchata Frappuccinos, it stood out. That evening, a customer came through the drive-thru and ordered 2 venti Horchata Frappuccinos. The order was normal in every other way. I entered it into the register system. The machine printed the stickers containing the drink information. I pulled them, attached one to each venti cup, and placed the cups near the blenders so my coworker could begin preparing them while I continued cleaning. I clearly remember the cups sitting beside the blending station. I also remember seeing him begin the order. He measured the ingredients into the cups, poured them into the blender containers with the ice, and started preparing the drinks. Nothing about the moment seemed confusing. I was not alone in trying to remember whether I had completed a step. The order existed in the system. The stickers had printed. The cups were labeled. My coworker had read those labels and started making the drinks. I watched him pour the ingredients. Then I picked up another load of dirty dishes and carried them toward the back. Closing shifts involve constant movement, so I did not stand there and watch the drinks blend from beginning to end. I trusted that my coworker would finish them while I handled the dishes. A couple of additional cars arrived in the drive-thru. We took their orders and continued working. Everything remained normal. There was no power failure. No alarm went off. Neither of us left the store. No one entered the employee area and interfered with the drinks. Somewhere between starting the 2 Horchata Frappuccinos and dealing with the next few customers, the order disappeared. At first, one of us probably noticed that the drinks were no longer at the blending station. The exact moment is difficult to reconstruct because we were both moving through our usual closing tasks. But when we looked properly, the 2 blender containers were empty. They were also clean. The blenders were sitting on the rack as if no drinks had ever been prepared in them. The venti cups were gone. The stickers were gone. The order had also disappeared from the register system. There was no car waiting at the drive-thru window. For a moment, we assumed the customer had left. People sometimes became impatient and drove away before receiving their orders. It was annoying, but it happened. If that was the explanation, though, the drinks should still have existed. They might have been sitting near the handoff area, melting while we wondered where the customer went, or my coworker might have thrown them away after noticing the car had left. But he had not done that. Neither had I. We checked with the customers still in the drive-thru line. They told us no vehicle had pulled out. That line was designed in a way that made leaving difficult once a car had entered. Depending on the location, some drive-through lanes are bordered by curbs, walls, landscaping, or other barriers that prevent vehicles from simply turning away. Even if there had been an escape route, the other customers should have noticed a car leaving. They had not. The vehicle that ordered the two venti drinks seemed to have vanished along with the order. We began checking the store. We looked around the blending station and the counters, thinking one of us might have moved the drinks without remembering. The cups were not near the drive-through window. They were not beside another machine. They were not hidden behind containers or cleaning supplies. We checked the rubbish. That was the most obvious place the cups could have gone. Maybe my coworker had realized he made an error, thrown the cups away, and then forgotten because we were busy. Perhaps I had picked them up with the dirty dishes without noticing and discarded them. But there were no venti cups with the printed labels in the bins. There was no large amount of pale blended drink spilled into the rubbish. There were no stickers peeled off and stuck to a lid, counter, or glove. The ingredients were gone as completely as the containers. That was when the situation began feeling wrong. A register order can disappear because of a software error. The system might refresh, crash, or remove a completed transaction from the active queue. That would not explain the physical cups disappearing. A customer could leave the drive-through. That would not clean the blenders or remove the drinks from behind the counter. One of us could throw the drinks away. That would not explain why neither of us remembered doing it, why the cups were not in the rubbish, or why the blender containers were clean and returned neatly to the rack. We asked each other what happened. Neither of us knew. My coworker remembered the order. He remembered measuring the ingredients. He remembered pouring everything into the blender containers. I remembered printing the stickers and attaching them to the cups. We were not debating whether the drinks had been started. We both knew they had. The store was not so busy that an hour of orders had blurred together. The horchata flavor was unusual enough to stand out, and ordering two Ventus made it even more memorable. For several minutes, we tried to reconstruct the sequence. The customer ordered. I entered it. The labels printed. I placed them on the cups. My coworkers started the drinks. Other cars arrived. Then, the drinks, cups, order, and customer were gone. It was as if that section of the night had been removed. The only things left were our memories. We might have continued working because there was little else we could do. There were other customers to serve, and the store still had to be closed. We were unsettled, but we also expected some ordinary explanation to reveal itself. Maybe the cups would be found behind something. Perhaps the register would restore the order. One of us might suddenly remember carrying the drinks to the wrong location. About 5 minutes later, my coworker turned toward the blending station. The blender container was back on the stand. The drinks were inside it. The cups had returned to the counter where he had originally placed them. They were missing the stickers. Neither of us had remade them. Neither of us had heard the blender running. That machine was not silent. Even in a noisy cafe, a blender starting nearby was obvious. During a quieter closing shift, it would have been nearly impossible to miss. The motor was loud enough to interrupt conversation. If someone had recreated two venti frappuccinos, the blender would have needed to run. Ingredients would have been measured. Ice would have been scooped. Cups would have been brought back to the counter. Yet neither of us heard or saw any of that. The drinks simply reappeared. The blender container now held the mixture that had vanished. The two venti cups sat where we remembered them, but the labels I had attached were no longer there. There was no customer waiting in the drive-through. No vehicle had returned to claim the order. The register did not restore the original transaction. We stood there, staring at the drinks. Neither of us wanted to touch them at first. The situation was too specific to dismiss as ordinary forgetfulness. If my coworker had secretly remade them as a prank, I would have heard the blender. If I had somehow done it myself, he would have seen me. We were working in the same small area. There was nowhere to prepare 2 large drinks without being noticed. The cups also returned without their stickers. That detail made the reappearance feel incomplete, as though the physical objects had come back, but the part connected to the order system had not. The drinks existed again. The order did not. The customer did not. I do not remember what we eventually did with them. We probably threw them away because there was nobody to serve, and neither of us trusted what had happened. It is possible we left them for a short time while we tried to understand the situation. What I remember clearly is how frightened we both became. This was not one employee telling a strange story to someone who had seen nothing. We had shared the entire process. I handled the order at the register. He handled the preparation. We both saw the absence. We both searched for the missing items. We both saw them after they returned. There was no easy way for either of us to explain it to the other. The most reasonable possibility is that our memories became confused during a busy period. Closing shifts can be tiring. People work on autopilot, especially after repeating the same actions hundreds of times. I may have believed I printed stickers for the horchata order when the labels actually belonged to another transaction. My coworker may have started different drinks. The order might have been canceled or cleared from the system. Later, another set of cups and blended ingredients could have appeared similar enough that we connected them to the earlier order. But that explanation does not fit how unusual the flavor was. 2 venti horchata frappuccinos were not something we made repeatedly that night. We both remembered that exact combination. The blender mixture also matched what he had prepared. The cups returned to the same area. There was no new drive-through order that would have required those drinks. Another possibility is that one of us finished the drinks and handed them out without remembering. The customer then drove away normally. The order cleared from the screen because it had been completed. Later, someone placed a different blender and 2 unused cups on the counter, and our tired minds mistook them for the missing items. That could explain the cleared register and absent vehicle. It would not explain why the blender later contained the horchata mixture, or why both of us remembered searching the empty station. If the drinks had been served, they could not return inside the blender. Perhaps the original customer canceled the order. One of us may have discarded the cups, cleaned the blender containers, and cleared the transaction. 5 minutes later, another employee could have started remaking the drinks after misunderstanding something. But only the 2 of us were closing. There was no third employee working unseen in the back. No one else could have handled the drinks. The customer might have driven around the building and returned, but there was still no car waiting when the drinks reappeared. There was also no order on the screen instructing us to remake them. Could my coworker have been playing a prank? He was borrowed from another store and may have thought it would be funny to confuse me. He could have hidden the drinks in cups, cleaned or swapped the blender containers, then returned everything while I was distracted. But the timing and physical steps make that difficult. 2 venti blended drinks are not easy to hide. The blender containers would have contained cold liquid and ice. Carrying them elsewhere would risk spilling or making noise. The cups would still need to be stored somewhere. He would have had to remove the stickers, clear the register order, convince the customer to leave, and return the items without me seeing. He also appeared genuinely frightened. He did not laugh or reveal a joke. I had enjoyed working with him because he was helpful and straightforward. Nothing about his reaction suggested he had planned the situation. Could I have been the one confused? Maybe I had been more tired than I realized. It is possible to perform routine tasks without forming strong memories. I might have cleared the order and moved items while thinking about something else, but both of us would have needed to experience matching memory gaps. We would each have forgotten different actions that together created the same impossible sequence. I would have forgotten removing the order and stickers. He would have forgotten cleaning and restoring the blenders. One of us would have forgotten disposing of or hiding the drinks. Then one of us would have forgotten remaking them. That is a large amount of coordinated missing memory during only a few minutes. A system error could explain part of it. Restaurant register systems sometimes remove, duplicate, or delay orders. A transaction may vanish from one display while remaining active elsewhere. Tickets can fail to print or print twice. But no computer error can physically remove cups and clean blender containers. Technology might explain why the order disappeared. It cannot explain why the drinks disappeared with it. The drive-through vehicle remains another problem. We remembered taking the order from a real customer. There should have been a car in the line. The customers behind it said nobody drove away. Could we have heard an order transmitted from another store or from an old recording? Drive-through headsets sometimes pick up interference. Perhaps a signal from a nearby location entered our system. We may have heard a customer ordering at the Starbucks down the road, mistakenly entered the request, and then realized no corresponding car existed in our lane. That would actually explain why the partner was familiar with the other store, although I do not know whether the communication systems could overlap that way. It would not explain the customers behind the missing vehicle. If there was never a car in front of them, why did neither of us notice that while taking the order? Maybe the vehicle belonged to one of the later customers, and we confused the sequence. The human mind is not perfect at tracking several similar cars in darkness. Still, the physical disappearance and return would remain unexplained. Security cameras might have provided an answer. Most stores have cameras covering registers, entrances, and employee areas. I do not remember whether we reviewed the footage or had access to it. As regular employees, we probably could not simply open the security system whenever we wanted. A manager would have needed to become involved. Explaining that 2 drinks vanished and returned would have sounded ridiculous. We may have worried about getting blamed for wasting ingredients or mishandling an order. The store was closing, and nothing had been stolen from the till. So, the event remained between us. I have sometimes wondered what a camera would have shown. Perhaps the footage would reveal one of us calmly moving the drinks while the other looked away. Maybe it would show the customer driving off through a route we failed to notice. The mysterious 5 minutes might become an ordinary sequence of rushed employees misremembering their actions. That is probably what happened. But there is another possibility that bothers me. What if the camera showed the same thing we experienced? The drinks on the counter. Then nothing. Then, several minutes later, the cups and blender mixture present again without anyone approaching them. I do not know whether that would frighten me more or finally give me relief. At least it would confirm we were not imagining it. The event is difficult to tell because it lacks a dramatic figure or obvious supernatural presence. No ghost appeared. No voice spoke. Nothing attacked us. 2 drinks simply stopped existing and then returned. That smallness makes it more unsettling. A ghost story can be dismissed as fear and darkness. A shadow can be blamed on lighting. A voice can be misunderstood. But the Starbucks order involved a chain of ordinary physical actions. A customer spoke. The register recorded the transaction. Labels printed. Cups were selected. Ingredients were measured. The blender was used. Then, every result of those actions vanished. When the physical items returned, the information connecting them to the customer was missing. It almost felt as though reality had corrected itself badly. The drinks came back, but the stickers did not. The order did not reappear. The customer remained absent. It was as if 2 versions of the night had briefly overlapped. In one version, the order was placed and the drinks were started. In another, No customer ever arrived. For several minutes, we seemed to be standing in the version where nothing happened. Then, part of the first version returned to the counter. I do not claim that is what actually occurred. Ideas about time slips or alternate realities are more complicated than ordinary workplace confusion, and there is no evidence for them beyond our memory. But that is what the event felt like. The disappearance was too complete. The reappearance was too incomplete. The drinks returned without the transaction that created them. People sometimes describe losing objects and later finding them in places already searched. Keys disappear from a table and return hours later. A phone is missing from a room and appears in the center of the bed. Most of these stories can be explained by attention and memory. Someone moves the item without noticing. Another person returns it. The searcher overlooks an obvious place because they expect the object elsewhere. Our situation may have been a workplace version of that. We were tired. We were multitasking. We overlooked the drinks, then found them. But we did not only lose cups. We lost the blender mixture, the customer, and the digital order at the same time. The entire process disappeared together. Then, only the physical drinks came back. My coworker's reaction is one of the reasons the memory remains so clear. If I had been alone, I might have convinced myself that I made a mistake. I would assume I imagined preparing the order or accidentally cleared it. With another person present, that became harder. He remembered his own separate part. I did not need to tell him what I saw. He already knew. We checked the rubbish together. We questioned the customers together. Then he turned and saw the drinks back on the stand. His shock matched mine. Neither of us had an explanation to offer. There are moments when people make eye contact and immediately understand that something is wrong. That was one of them. We did not need to argue about whether the drinks had been there before. We both knew. I wish I remembered the exact words we exchanged. We probably kept repeating questions. Did you remake those? Where did those come from? Were those there a second ago? Maybe one of us swore. The precise conversation has faded, but the confusion has not. I can still picture the blender container sitting on the stand after being absent. I can see the 2 cups on the counter. The places where the stickers should have been were blank. We never found those labels. If the cups had been thrown away and later recovered, someone would have needed to peel the stickers off. Why? If the drinks had traveled through some ordinary sequence, the labels should have remained attached. Their absence made the cups feel less like the originals, even though they were positioned where we remembered. Maybe they were different cups. Perhaps the blender contents belonged to another forgotten order. That is possible. But there was nobody waiting for those drinks. No tickets told us what they were. They appeared as finished ingredients without a customer. A cafe is built around tracking orders. Every drink begins with a request and ends with a handoff. These had neither. After the shift, I probably drove home still thinking about it. The store would have looked normal once the equipment was cleaned and the lights were switched off. The next morning, employees arrived and began another day without knowing anything unusual had happened. There was no lasting damage, no missing money, no customer complaint, no reason for the event to become an official incident. The memory survived only because the 2 of us experienced it together. I never learned whether my coworker told people at his regular store. He may have decided that talking about it would make him sound careless or strange. I do not know whether he still remembers it as clearly as I do. Part of me would like to ask him. If his memory matches mine after several years, that would reinforce that the sequence happened as I recall. If his version differs, it might show how much the story has changed in my mind. Perhaps he remembers finding the cups in an overlooked corner. Maybe he recalls the customer leaving. There could be an explanation that I forgot. But at the time, we were both incredibly freaked out. That reaction is certain. People do not usually become frightened because they temporarily misplace two drinks. We felt that something had happened outside the normal order of events. Even now, I try to reduce it to the most likely answer. We were tired. The store was active enough for our attention to be divided. The register behaved unexpectedly. We moved objects without forming clear memories. The customer left, or was never where we thought. 5 minutes later, we confused another set of items with the original drinks. That collection of mistakes is unlikely, but unlikely things happen. It is still more reasonable than time changing inside a Starbucks. Yet whenever I replay the event, the timeline remains stubbornly simple. A customer ordered 2 venti horchata frappuccinos. I entered the order and attached the stickers. My coworker poured the ingredients into the blender with ice. We both saw the drinks being made. Then, the cups, blender contents, order, and car were gone. The customers behind it said nobody had left the line. We checked the store and the rubbish. There was nothing. 5 minutes later, the drinks returned to the blending station. The cups were back on the counter. The stickers were missing. No blender had run. No one had remade them. There was no customer waiting. The event did not feel like a haunting in the usual sense. It felt like a mistake in the sequence of reality. For a few minutes, an order that both of us remembered had never happened. Then part of it came back. To this day, I have no explanation for where those drinks went, how they returned, or what happened to the person who ordered them. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. About a year ago, so the memory is still recent enough that I can picture most of the night clearly. My father and I had gone camping in the mountains. It was the kind of camping trip we normally enjoyed, far enough from towns that there was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and almost no sign of other people once the sun went down. We had been to remote places before, so the isolation did not bother us. That was part of the reason we went. We wanted a break from phones, traffic, work, school, and everything else that followed us during normal life. The campsite was surrounded by thick brush and trees. During the day, the mountains were peaceful. We could see long stretches of forest, uneven trails, exposed rock, and distant slopes disappearing into the sky. At night, all of that became darkness. Once the campfire weakened, the trees seemed to close around us. The beam from a flashlight reached only so far before being swallowed by the woods. We had also brought an M1 Garand rifle that we had recently bought. There was a shooting range nearby, and we planned to fire a few rounds there during the trip. The rifle was not meant for hunting anything around the campsite. We had brought it legally and responsibly for the range. That evening, after we were finished with everything, my father told me to clean it before going to bed. He went into his tent while I stayed outside with the rifle and cleaning supplies. The campsite was quiet. There were normal wilderness sounds around us, wind in the trees, insects, branches moving, and the occasional animal somewhere in the distance. Nothing seemed threatening. I was focused on cleaning the rifle when a loud screech came from somewhere nearby. The sound was so sudden and violent that I stopped moving. It did not resemble any animal call I recognized. I was not an expert on wildlife, and I knew animals could produce strange noises. Foxes, owls, mountain lions, and other creatures can make sounds that seem almost human. But this screech was extremely loud. It sounded close to the campsite. For several seconds, I remained still and listened. The forest went quiet again. I looked toward my father's tent, expecting him to come out and ask what had happened. But he remained inside. Maybe he had heard the noise and assumed I knew what it was. Perhaps the tent material had muffled it enough that it did not seem as close to him. I told myself it was only an animal. We were camping in its territory, after all. The woods were filled with creatures we could not see. Hearing one call in the night should not have been unusual. Even so, I no longer felt comfortable sitting with my back toward the brush. I kept looking into the darkness. About a minute after the screech, I noticed two red points in the vegetation. At first, I thought they were reflections. They were positioned close together at roughly the height of a person's face. But distance and darkness can be deceptive. The eyes of many animals reflect red or orange when light strikes them. The strange thing was that I had not yet aimed my flashlight toward them. The red points seemed visible on their own. They remained completely still. I stared at them, trying to understand whether I was looking at an animal or two small lights farther away. Then I picked up my flashlight and aimed it into the brush. The beam revealed something standing there. I froze. The figure was extremely tall, somewhere around 7 to 7.5 feet by my estimate. It stood upright on two legs, although its posture was slightly bent, as if it were leaning forward to watch me. Its body did not look properly human. The head resembled the skull of a deer. I could see a long shape where the face should have been, with hollow-looking areas around the eyes and an unnatural mouth. There appeared to be blood across its body, especially around its mouth and lower face. I could not tell whether the blood belonged to the creature or to an animal it had been eating. The light shook in my hand. The figure did not immediately run. It stood at the edge of the brush and looked toward me. The red eyes remained visible even under the flashlight beam. I wanted to call for my father, but for a moment I could not speak. My mind tried to identify the thing as something ordinary. A person wearing an animal skull. A hunter in some kind of camouflage. A prankster. A large deer standing at a strange angle. But none of those explanations fit what I was seeing. A normal deer would not stand upright like a person. A human wearing a skull would still move like a human, and there was no reason for anyone to approach an isolated campsite covered in blood in the middle of the night. I finally made enough noise that my father came out of his tent. He looked annoyed at first, probably believing I had dropped something or become frightened by an animal. Then he followed the direction of my flashlight. He saw the figure too. That is one of the most important parts of the experience. I was not alone. I was tired and frightened, and I could have misinterpreted an animal in poor light. But my father stood beside me and looked at the same shape. At first, he thought someone was trying to scare us. From a distance, the deer's skull head could have been a mask. The blood could have been paint or part of a costume. My father shouted at it. He told whoever it was to leave us alone and get away from the campsite. The figure remained still for a moment. Then it moved forward. It did not rush immediately. It took a slow step toward us. Then, another. The careful movement frightened me more than if it had run away. A normal animal faced with two people, a bright flashlight and shouting would usually retreat. A prankster who had been discovered might laugh, remove the mask, or escape into the trees. This thing continued approaching. My father warned it again. It did not respond. It only came closer. My father reached for the M1 Garand I had been cleaning. He loaded it and raised the rifle toward the figure. He told it to stop. For a second, everything seemed completely still. The flashlight beam remained fixed on the creature. My father had the rifle aimed. The figure stood near the edge of the brush, watching us. Then it began sprinting directly toward the campsite. The change was immediate. One moment, it was moving slowly. The next, it was charging at full speed. My father fired. The sound of the first shot exploded through the campsite and echoed across the mountains. He continued firing until all 8 rounds were gone. I cannot say with certainty how many bullets struck the figure. The darkness, movement, noise, and panic made it impossible to see clearly. My father was aiming at it, and at least some of the rounds appeared to hit or pass extremely close. The creature reacted. It changed direction and ran back toward the forest. Within seconds, it disappeared into the darkness. There was no visible body on the ground. We did not hear it collapse. We heard movement crashing through the brush for a short time. Then, nothing. The forest became silent again. My father and I stood there, stunned. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. The rifle was empty. My flashlight still pointed toward the place where the creature had vanished. Neither of us wanted to follow it. Even if it had been a person wearing a costume, approaching after the shooting would have been dangerous. If it was a wounded animal, it could attack from the brush. And if it was what it appeared to be, we had no idea what we were dealing with. The fact that it continued running after the shots terrified us. A 30-06 rifle is powerful. We knew that a large animal could sometimes survive being shot, especially if the rounds missed vital areas, but we had just watched the figure run away at speed. It did not seem to weaken or fall. We did not wait to see whether it returned. We began packing immediately. We left behind anything that was not important enough to spend time collecting. The tents, equipment, and supplies were thrown into the vehicle as quickly as possible. Every sound in the forest made us turn around. I kept expecting the red eyes to reappear between the trees. My father reloaded the rifle, but neither of us wanted another encounter. The campsite no longer felt like a place where we were visiting nature. It felt as though we had entered somewhere we were not supposed to be, and had attracted the attention of something that belonged there. Once everything essential was packed, we got into the vehicle and drove away. The road out of the mountains was dark and uneven. There was no cell signal, so we could not call anyone until we reached a more populated area. I kept looking through the back window. I imagined the figure running behind us or appearing farther down the road. Nothing followed that we could see. We eventually made it home safely. Neither of us slept much. In daylight, the event became easier to question. The creature could have been a person. Someone may have worn a deer skull or mask as part of a prank, ritual, or attempt to frighten campers. The blood could have been fake. When my father fired, the person may have escaped because none of the bullets actually hit them. 8 rounds fired in darkness at a moving target do not guarantee 8 hits. Adrenaline can also distort perception. What seemed like a 7-foot creature may have been a tall person standing on uneven ground. The apparent red eyes could have been reflective lenses in a mask. That explanation was possible, but it raised another question. Why would someone charge directly toward an armed man after being warned? Even if they believed the rifle was unloaded, sprinting toward us would have been an extreme risk. Maybe they were intoxicated, mentally unwell, or unable to understand the danger. A person behaving that way would be frightening enough without anything supernatural being involved. A large animal was another possibility. A deer with a damaged or partially decomposed face could look like it had a skull for a head. Disease or injury can change the appearance of wildlife in disturbing ways. Chronic wasting disease and other illnesses can cause animals to behave strangely, lose weight, stumble, or show little fear of people. Blood around the mouth could have come from an injury. But a deer would not normally stand upright and run toward us on two legs. Perhaps the angle of the brush hid its front legs and made its posture look human. When it charged, the movement may have appeared bipedal because of the flashlight and darkness. The mind can misread a fast-moving animal when only part of the body is visible. A bear could stand on its hind legs and appear 7 feet tall. Its head might look skeletal if the fur was damaged, or if it carried part of an animal carcass. A bear could also survive gunfire if the shots missed or only caused minor wounds. However, we did not recognize the body as a bear. My father had enough outdoor experience to identify common wildlife. He insisted the thing looked humanoid. The screech did not help. Mountain lions can produce terrifying screams. A cougar near the campsite could make the initial sound, and a different animal or person could have been in the brush afterward. The two events may not have been connected, but at the time it seemed obvious that the screech came from the figure. We never returned the next morning to search for blood, tracks, or shell casings. Doing so might have answered everything. If we found human footprints, we would know someone had been wearing a costume. If we found animal tracks, the creature could probably be identified. Blood on the ground might show whether it had been hit. Instead, fear made us leave. I do not regret that decision. Searching an isolated forest for something that had charged us would have been reckless. But because we never investigated, the sighting remained unresolved. The experience might have ended as one terrifying night in the mountains. Instead, a few days later, my father and I began noticing black vans. At first, it did not seem connected. Black vans are common. Businesses use them. Delivery companies, contractors, security workers, and ordinary families drive them. Seeing one after a frightening camping trip should not mean anything. But we began feeling as though the vehicles appeared too often. Sometimes a black van was parked near my school. Other times, my father noticed one near his workplace or on the road while he was driving home. We also saw people wearing dark business suits. I felt as though they were watching us. When I walked home from school, I would notice someone standing near a vehicle or across the street. If I looked again, they might turn away, enter the van, or simply remain where they were. My father reported similar experiences. Because both of us had seen the creature, we began connecting the vans to the campsite. We wondered whether someone knew what happened. Maybe the figure belonged to a secret government project. Perhaps the shooting had triggered some kind of monitoring. Maybe there were people assigned to watch witnesses and make sure they did not report what they saw. Those thoughts became difficult to control. The more we looked for black vans, the more we noticed them. Every dark vehicle became suspicious. Every well-dressed stranger seemed connected. We told other family members, but they did not believe us. From their perspective, the story sounded impossible. My father and I had gone camping with a rifle, seen something in the woods, fired at it, and then returned claiming we were being watched by men in suits. They probably thought fear had made us paranoid. Maybe they were right about that part. After a traumatic event, the brain remains alert for danger. Ordinary coincidences begin to feel connected. A van that would normally be ignored becomes evidence. A stranger looking in your direction becomes surveillance. Once we believed someone might be following us, we noticed every detail that supported the idea and overlooked all the times nothing happened. That does not mean the vans were imaginary. We saw real vehicles and real people. The uncertainty was about their purpose. We had no photographs, license plate records, direct confrontations, or evidence that the same people appeared repeatedly. No one approached us. No one threatened us. The men never mentioned the mountains or the creature. They may have had nothing to do with us. The sightings stopped after a few weeks. The vans no longer appeared often enough to stand out. The suited people disappeared from our attention. Life gradually returned to normal. That should have reassured me. If an organization truly wanted to watch us, it could have continued without being obvious. But that thought creates a situation in which no evidence can ever disprove the fear. If I see a van, I could say they are watching. If I do not see one, I could say they have become better at hiding. Thinking that way makes it impossible to know what is real. I try not to do that now. The most reasonable explanation is that the people and vehicles were unrelated. My father and I were frightened after the campsite encounter, and we interpreted ordinary events as part of the same threat. The creature itself is harder to dismiss because we both saw it at the same time. Shared perception does not guarantee accuracy, especially at night, but it means the experience was not only a dream or private hallucination. Something was in the brush. Something had reflective or red-looking eyes. It was large enough to frighten both of us. It moved toward the campsite after being warned, then charged. My father fired, and it fled into the forest. Everything beyond those basic details is uncertain. Its exact height may have been wrong. The deer skull appearance may have come from a mask, injury, or poor lighting. The blood may have been mud, dark fur, or shadows. The bullets may all have missed. The creature may have survived because it was never hit. Those are possible explanations, and I would rather believe one of them. I have told friends at school. Some believe me. Others laugh or say my father and I saw a bear, deer, or prankster. I understand why. If someone else told me the same story, I would question it too. The image sounds like something from folklore. A tall humanoid with a deer skull, red eyes, and blood around its mouth. Stories about such creatures are common online. People give them names and connect them to legends, forests, or supposed secret experiments. I do not know whether any of those stories are true. I do not want to choose a name and pretend that identifies what we saw. A label would not create evidence. It would only make the memory fit an existing legend. I also know that repeated retelling can change details. A figure estimated at 6 feet in the moment becomes 7 feet later. Eyes reflecting orange become glowing red. A blood-like stain becomes fresh blood. A fast escape becomes proof that bullets had no effect. I have tried to remain aware of that. The sighting happened quickly, under stress, with one flashlight providing most of the visibility. We were not measuring the figure. We were trying to survive what felt like an attack. Still, there are things I cannot explain away. The screech came first. The red eyes appeared in the brush. The body stood upright. My father saw it. It moved closer after being warned. Then it sprinted toward us. That sequence is why the memory stays with me. If the figure had run away as soon as the flashlight hit it, I could accept that it was wildlife. If it had spoken or removed the skull, I could accept that it was a person. Instead, it behaved in a way that fit neither explanation properly. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had not brought the rifle. Would the creature have stopped before reaching us? Was it only trying to frighten us away? Maybe it was injured and confused. Perhaps it charged because the flashlight hurt its eyes, or because we were near its food. The gunfire may have scared it rather than wounded it. We might have survived without firing at all. There is no way to know. I am also aware that firing into darkness was dangerous. There could have been another camper, ranger, or person beyond the figure. My father believed we were about to be attacked and reacted in panic, but the situation could have ended much worse. That is another reason we did not immediately report everything. Explaining that we fired 8 rounds at an unidentified shape would have brought serious questions. We had no body, blood trail, or evidence of what had charged us. We feared we would not be believed, or that we would be blamed for shooting recklessly. So we stayed quiet except for telling family and friends. That silence probably helped the later fear grow. Without an official report or investigation, we had no outside explanation. The mystery remained entirely between my father and me. We repeated the details to each other. Each time, the event felt more significant. Then the vans appeared, and we added another layer. I sometimes think the later surveillance fear was our attempt to make sense of the creature. An impossible thing is easier to accept if someone powerful already knows about it. The black vans created a story in which the world remained organized. The creature was not random. It was being monitored. The men in suits were not strangers. They were part of a secret. That explanation may have felt better than admitting we had seen something we could never identify. But it also made the experience follow us home. The forest was no longer the only dangerous place. School, work, and ordinary streets began feeling connected to the campsite. I am glad that feeling eventually weakened. I still occasionally notice a black van and feel my stomach tighten. Then I remind myself how many such vehicles exist. I look for real evidence instead of allowing fear to decide. Most of the time, the van continues down the road and never appears again. No one steps out. Nothing happens. The memory of the mountains is different. I cannot watch it drive away. It remains frozen at the edge of the flashlight beam. A tall body in the brush. A pale skull-like head. Red eyes looking toward us. Blood around the mouth. My father shouting for it to leave. Then the slow step forward. Another step. The rifle rising. The sudden charge. 8 shots echoing through the trees. The figure turning and disappearing into the black forest. Maybe it was a person in a mask. Maybe it was a sick animal seen from the wrong angle. Maybe the darkness, adrenaline, and our expectations changed what we saw. I hope one of those explanations is true. They would mean the world still follows familiar rules. But I have never found an ordinary animal that matches the image in my memory. My father has not changed his story either. We both know how frightened the other looked. We both remember packing without discussing whether we should stay. The decision to leave was immediate. Whatever stood in the brush had convinced 2 people that the campsite was no longer safe. The black vans may have been coincidence. The suited people may never have noticed us. I cannot honestly say anyone is still watching. That fear came after the encounter and may have existed mainly because we were unable to explain it. But the creature itself was there. At least something was. It screamed close to our campsite. It watched me from the brush. It stood when I shone the flashlight. My father came out and saw it too. Then it ran toward us. Sometimes I think about the fact that we never found out where it went after entering the trees. It could have collapsed a short distance away. It could have continued across the mountain. It could have been watching us while we packed. Perhaps the gunfire only made it retreat until we left. We drove away believing we had escaped it. Maybe we did. About a year has passed, and I have not seen the creature again. No red eyes have appeared outside my home. No screech has woken me. The black van stopped standing out after those first few weeks. Everything is normal now. Still, I do not feel the same about camping. When darkness surrounds a campsite, I no longer think only about bears, mountain lions, or ordinary wildlife. I remember that flashlight beam reaching into the brush. For a second, there were only 2 red points. Then, the light revealed the rest. And somewhere behind every normal explanation is the same question my father and I have never answered. What did we shoot at that night? And how did it keep running? When I was very young, I became seriously ill with an aggressive form of pneumonia. The infection became so severe that one of my lungs collapsed. I was admitted to the hospital, and at some point, I fell into a coma. I remained unconscious for several weeks. I do not remember the illness itself clearly. Most of what I know about that time came from my mother and the other people who were at the hospital with us. My mother told me that the doctors tried everything they could, but my condition continued getting worse. Eventually, they reached a point where they no longer believed I would recover. They told my parents that I was probably not going to survive. They advised them to prepare for the worst. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for my mother to hear those words. She had spent weeks sitting near my hospital room, waiting for any sign that I might wake. She had watched doctors and nurses enter, examine me, adjust equipment, and leave without giving her the answers she wanted. Every day must have felt like a struggle between hope and reality. Even when the doctors remained careful with their language, she could see how serious the situation was. I was a child with one collapsed lung, trapped in a coma, and showing little improvement. Then the final conversation came. The doctors told her there was almost nothing more they could do. My mother left the room and sat in the hallway outside. Two other mothers were there with her. I do not know whether their own children were being treated in nearby rooms or whether they had met my mother during the weeks she spent at the hospital. What matters is that they were present. They sat with her and tried to comfort her after she received the news that her child was expected to die. My mother was crying. The other women spoke softly to her, but there were no words capable of making the situation better. The three of them remained seated outside my hospital room. Then an older man approached. My mother described him as being somewhere in his 60s or 70s. He walked with a cane and wore black clothing. There was something formal about the way he dressed, and when he reached my mother, he introduced himself as a priest. My mother did not recognize him. She had not called for a priest, and as far as she knew, the hospital had not told anyone to come. Still, seeing a priest in a hospital was not unusual. Hospitals often have chaplains or clergy who visit patients and families. They offer prayers, comfort people who have received bad news, and remain with relatives during final moments. The man asked my mother whether he could pray for me. She agreed. At that point, she believed I was dying. If there was even a small chance that prayer could help, she was willing to accept it, even if it changed nothing physically. She may have hoped it would bring peace to me or to the family. The two other mothers watched the conversation. All three women saw the priest enter my room. There was only one normal entrance. The man opened the door, walked inside with his cane, and closed or partly closed the door behind him. My mother remained in the hallway. She decided to give the priest privacy. She did not want to interrupt while he prayed beside my bed, especially after he had been kind enough to offer. At first, she could hear his voice from inside the room. The words were not always clear through the door, but she could hear him speaking in the steady rhythm of prayer. She sat outside and listened. 5 minutes passed. Then the voice stopped. The hallway became quiet. My mother waited for the priest to come out. He did not. After a short time, she began wondering whether he had finished praying or whether something was wrong. She prepared to stand and check the room. Before she could enter, the door opened. I walked out. I had been unconscious for weeks. The doctors had just told my parents that I was not going to survive. Yet, I came through the doorway awake and standing on my own. My mother stared at me. For a moment, she may not have understood what she was seeing. I was not calling weakly from the bed or slowly opening my eyes while surrounded by medical staff. I had apparently awakened, gotten out of the hospital bed, and walked to the door. My mother rushed toward me. She was crying and screaming, overwhelmed by the sight of me standing there. The other two mothers witnessed it as well. Then, my mother remembered the priest. If I had walked out of the room, the man should still have been inside. She entered quickly. There was no one there. The room was empty except for me, the bed, and the hospital equipment. The priest was gone. My mother checked the bathroom. No one was inside. She looked around the room, searching for another doorway or place where he might be standing. There was nowhere for him to hide. She even checked beneath the bed. The man was not there. The room had only one door, the same door through which I had just walked. My mother and the other two women had been sitting outside it. If the priest left through that entrance, at least one of them should have seen him. The room was on the 16th floor. He could not have quietly climbed out of the window, especially as an elderly man walking with a cane. There was no second hallway, service door, or connecting room that would allow him to leave unseen. He had entered. They heard him praying. Then I walked out, and he was gone. My mother began crying even harder. Her screams brought nurses and doctors into the room. At first, they probably assumed there had been an emergency. Instead, they found the child they believed was dying standing awake. They were shocked. According to my mother, they could not understand how I had regained consciousness so suddenly. They examined me and expected to find me weak, confused, or still dangerously ill. But I seemed fine. I did not appear like a child who had just spent weeks in a coma because of severe pneumonia and a collapsed lung. My mother said I behaved almost as though nothing had happened. The doctors and nurses began asking questions. They wanted to know when I woke, how I got out of bed, and whether anyone had been inside the room. My mother told them about the priest. She described the elderly man, his black clothing, and the cane. She explained that he introduced himself and asked permission to pray for me. She told them that 3 people watched him enter and that none of them saw him leave. The hospital staff looked confused. At first, they may have assumed she was mistaken about his identity. Perhaps another chaplain or visiting clergyman had entered the room. Maybe he belonged to a local church and had come to comfort families. But when she described him more carefully, the staff recognized the man. According to my mother, they told her that the priest she was describing was dead. He had passed away before that day. It should have been impossible for him to walk through the hospital, speak to her, and enter my room. My mother believed he had returned as an angel. To her, the timing was too exact to be coincidence. The doctors had told her to prepare for my death. An unknown priest appeared and asked to pray for me. He entered a room with no second exit. His voice stopped. Then I woke from a coma and walked out. When she searched, the priest had disappeared. The hospital staff recognized the description as someone who had already died. My mother believed he had been sent to save me. The following day, I was discharged from the hospital. That part of the story sounds nearly as impossible as the disappearance. A child who had been in a coma for weeks with severe pneumonia and a collapsed lung would normally need careful observation and a long recovery. Even after waking, there might be weakness, breathing problems, confusion, or complications from being immobile. But according to my mother, I recovered so quickly that I was allowed to leave the next day. I showed no obvious sign of the illness that had nearly killed me. I grew up hearing this story. For my mother, it was never only a strange hospital event. It was proof that something intervened when medicine could do nothing more. She had already begun preparing herself to lose me. Then, the priest appeared. I understand why she believed he was an angel. From her perspective, the sequence was direct. Prayer entered the room, death left it. There are possible ordinary explanations, though none accounts for every detail perfectly. The priest may have been a living man whom the hospital staff confused with someone else. Older priests often dressed similarly, and a brief description of a man in black with a cane might match more than one person. Hospital employees may have thought my mother meant a former chaplain who had died, while the actual visitor was someone else. In the shock of the moment, the conversation may also have been misunderstood or retold differently later. Perhaps the staff said the priest resembled someone who had passed away, rather than stating with certainty that he was the same man. Over the years, that uncertainty may have disappeared from the family story. The man could also have left without the women noticing. My mother and the two other mothers were under extreme emotional stress. They may have been crying, talking, or focused on one another. The priest could have walked out quietly while their attention was turned away. If he left shortly before I woke, none of them may have registered him passing. Hospitals are busy places. Nurses, doctors, visitors, and staff move constantly through hallways. A man dressed as a priest would not attract attention. He might have stepped around a corner or entered another room before my mother looked up. My mother remembered hearing his voice stop and then seeing me at the door, but the exact timing may have been less immediate than it felt. Several minutes might have passed. Memory often compresses emotional events. Actions that happened one after another become connected as though they occurred in the same instant. The room may also have had another exit that my family did not know about. Some hospital rooms connect to bathrooms, treatment areas, staff passages, or neighboring rooms. A door could have been hidden behind a curtain or equipment. The priest might have left through a route used by staff. However, my mother insisted there was only one door and that she searched every possible place. The 16th floor location also made an escape through the window impossible. Then, there's my recovery. Doctors sometimes give families the worst possible prognosis while still leaving room for uncertainty. When they told my parents to prepare for the worst, they may not have meant survival was absolutely impossible. They may have believed my chances were extremely low, but not zero. People occasionally recover unexpectedly from severe illnesses. A patient can remain unconscious for weeks and then wake with little warning. The body may begin responding to treatment after doctors have nearly lost hope. Rare recoveries do happen. My waking shortly after the prayer could have been coincidence. The priest entered during the same period when my condition naturally began improving. My mother connected the two events because they occurred close together. That does not mean the prayer medically caused the recovery. It also seems unlikely that I would wake, climb out of bed, and walk normally after such a long coma. But my mother may have simplified that part. Perhaps I first woke in bed. A nurse or someone else helped me stand. Maybe I walked only a few steps with support. In her memory, the event became me opening the door and walking into the hallway by myself. I do not say that to accuse her of lying. Trauma changes memory. A parent watching a dying child recover will remember the emotional truth more strongly than every medical detail. To her, I had been unreachable. Then I was awake and moving toward her. Whether I took 3 steps or crossed the whole room alone may not have mattered. The next day, discharge may also have been a transfer, temporary release, or later event compressed into the story. Medical records would be the best way to verify the exact timeline, but I do not know whether those records still exist or whether my family ever requested them. Without them, I have only my mother's account. Still, the presence of the 2 other mothers makes the priest's visit harder to dismiss as a stress-induced vision. My mother was not the only person who saw him. 3 adults watched the elderly man approach. They heard him introduce himself. They watched him enter the hospital room. If all 3 remembered the same event, then a real person was probably there. The question is who he was and how he left. He may have been an ordinary priest whose identity became confused afterward. He may have been a volunteer not officially connected to the hospital. Perhaps he heard about a dying child and came to pray. When I woke, he quietly left because he did not want attention. The hospital staff may never have identified him correctly. That is a reasonable possibility. But my mother remembered his disappearance as complete. She did not simply fail to notice him in the hallway. She searched the room while the other women remained near the only exit. No one saw him leave. The timing also matters emotionally. He arrived only after the doctors delivered the final terrible news. He did not appear earlier in the weeks I spent unconscious. He came when my mother's hope was almost gone. He asked for permission, entered, prayed for several minutes, and disappeared at the exact moment I woke. If this was coincidence, it was an extraordinary one. I have sometimes wondered what happened inside the room while he prayed. I cannot remember any voice, light, dream, or sensation. I have no memory of seeing the priest. I do not remember waking from the coma or walking through the door. My experience begins later. The miracle, if that is what it was, belongs mainly to my mother. She was the one who heard the prognosis. She was the one sitting outside the room, grieving. She spoke to the old man. She gave him permission to pray. She heard his voice. Then she saw me walk out. Perhaps I had a normal medical recovery, and the priest's disappearance was a misunderstanding. Even then, the encounter gave my mother something important. At the moment, she believed she was losing her child. Someone approached and offered compassion. He entered the room and prayed when she could not do anything else. Then, the outcome changed. For her, the experience transformed the worst day of her life into evidence that she was not alone. There is also something strange about the man carrying a cane. If my mother were inventing an idealized angel afterward, she might have described someone glowing, young, or powerful. Instead, she remembered an elderly man who needed help walking. He wore black and looked like a normal priest. Nothing about him seemed supernatural until he disappeared. That ordinary appearance makes the story more unsettling and more believable at the same time. He did not announce that he was an angel. He did not promise I would survive. He asked one simple question. Could he pray for me? Then he went inside. I have tried to imagine the three women sitting in the hallway. They had just been discussing death. The hospital around them continued operating normally. Machines sounded behind doors. Nurses moved between rooms. Other families received their own good or bad news. Then, an old man walked toward them with a cane. Maybe no one else in the hallway noticed him. Maybe people saw him and assumed he belonged there. He spoke to my mother quietly and entered my room. For 5 minutes, his prayer was audible. Then, silence. When the door opened, it was not the priest who came out. It was me. That is the image that has stayed with my family. A dying child replacing a dead priest in the doorway. One gone, the other returned. It is easy to understand why my mother saw meaning in that exchange. The hospital staff's recognition of the priest is the part I would most like to verify. Did they show my mother a photograph? Did they say his name? Had he once worked at that hospital? How long before my illness had he died? Those details would make the story much stronger, but I do not have them. I only know what my mother told me. The nurses and doctors heard her description and became confused because the man sounded like a priest they knew had passed away. If they had shown her a photograph and she identified him, that would be much harder to explain. If the resemblance was only general, mistaken identity remains possible. I do not want to add certainty where none exists. I also do not claim that prayer alone repaired a collapsed lung. The doctors and nurses cared for me for weeks. Medication, respiratory support, and constant monitoring kept me alive long enough to recover. Whatever someone believes about the priest, the medical team was part of my survival. My mother's story does not erase their work. It describes the moment when that work seemed to have failed and my condition changed unexpectedly. Maybe the timing was natural. Maybe the doctors underestimated my ability to recover. Perhaps my body had already begun improving before the priest arrived, and no one recognized it until I woke. That is possible. But my family remembers the event differently. They believe medicine brought me to the edge, and the old priest brought me back. I have no memory with which to challenge or confirm that belief. All I can do is look at the facts as they were told to me. I was a young child with severe pneumonia. One lung collapsed. I remained in a coma for weeks. The doctors told my parents I probably would not survive. My mother sat outside the room with two other women. An elderly priest dressed in black approached with a cane. He asked to pray for me. All three women watched him enter. They heard his voice for several minutes. Then the prayer stopped. The door opened, and I walked out awake. The room was empty. There was no second exit. We were on the 16th floor. The hospital staff believed the priest my mother described was already dead. The next day, I left the hospital. There are ordinary explanations for parts of the story. Memory can change. Doctors can be wrong. Visitors can leave unseen. People can resemble one another. Coincidences can happen during moments of intense emotion. But the entire sequence has never felt ordinary to my mother. She does not describe it as a dream or misunderstanding. She believes she met an angel. Perhaps she did. Perhaps a compassionate living priest entered, prayed, and left at exactly the right time. Perhaps my recovery had nothing to do with him, but his presence gave my mother the strength to survive those final minutes of uncertainty. Or perhaps something happened in that hospital room that cannot be explained by medicine, memory, or coincidence. I may never know. I was unconscious during nearly all of it. The first part of my life that I almost lost is now a story carried by other people. My mother remembers being told to prepare for my death. She remembers an old man with a cane walking toward her. She remembers giving him permission to enter. Then, she remembers the door opening. I came out. He did not. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.